The dust came at Clara like a living thing. She'd seen storms before, the kind that turned day into twilight, that made you taste Oklahoma in your teeth for a week. But this was different. This was the kind of storm that had a voice, a roar that started low in your belly and climbed up through your ribs until you couldn't tell if you were screaming or if the wind was doing it for you. Clara pressed herself against the side of an overturned wagon, its wood bleached gray by years of sun. Her canteen had run dry 6 miles back. The tin rattled empty against her hip, mocking her with every gust. She'd been walking since dawn, following a road that barely qualified as one, just 2 ruts carved into hardpan by wheels that probably didn't roll anymore. Stupid. She'd been so damn stupid. The farmer back in Stillwell had told her the next town was a straight shot east. "Can't miss it," he'd said, grinning with 3 teeth and a lifetime of bad decisions. "Just follow the road." There was no town. There was barely a road. And now there was just dust and wind and the creeping certainty that she'd finally pushed her luck too far. Clara wrapped her bandana tighter across her nose and mouth, but the dust found ways in. It always did. She could feel it coating the back of her throat, settling in her lungs like sediment at the bottom of a river. Her eyes burned. Her lips had cracked hours ago, thin lines of blood mixing with the grit on her skin. She needed to move. Staying put meant dying slow, and Clara Hale had never done anything slow in her life. The wind nearly knocked her flat the moment she left the wagon's shelter. She staggered, caught herself, pushed forward into nothing. Visibility was maybe 3 feet, maybe less. The world had shrunk to just her and the howling dark, and for the first time in 10 years of drifting, Clara felt something she'd worked hard to forget. Fear. Not the quick, sharp fear of a man's hand on her arm or a sheriff asking too many questions. This was older, deeper. The kind of fear that knows you're small and the world is vast and indifferent, and nothing you've survived before means a damn thing right now. Her boot caught on something, a root, a rock. She couldn't tell. Clara went down hard, her palms scraping against earth that felt like sandpaper. She tried to push herself up and her arms wouldn't cooperate. They shook. Everything shook. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up or die here." She got to her knees. That was as far as she made it before the coughing started, deep and wet, pulling dust and spit and what little moisture she had left. When it passed, she stayed there on all fours, head hanging, trying to remember why she'd thought this was a good idea. Running. She'd been running. Again. The details didn't matter. They never did. There was always something. A man who thought her smile meant more than it did. A boss who didn't like the way she looked at him when he shorted her pay. A town that decided drifters weren't welcome anymore. Claire had learned early that staying meant trouble, and trouble had a way of finding you even when you tried to be invisible. So she moved. Town to town, job to job, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions or expect answers. She cooked when she could find kitchen work, cleaned when she couldn't, and kept her head down and her bag packed. It was a lonely way to live, but lonely was safe. Lonely meant no one could take anything from you because you didn't have anything worth taking, except your life, apparently. The dust seemed pretty interested in that. Clara forced herself upright. The wind hit her like a fist, but she leaned into it, 1 foot in front of the other. She had no idea if she was still following the road, had no idea if there even was a road anymore. Direction had become a guess, and hope was running on fumes. How long she walked, she couldn't say. Time bent funny in a storm. Could have been 20 minutes. Could have been 2 hours. Her legs moved on instinct, her body running on something beyond exhaustion, beyond pain. She'd entered that strange territory where nothing felt real anymore, where you could almost convince yourself this was happening to someone else. Then her boot hit something solid, and she went down again. This time, she didn't get up right away. Couldn't. She lay there in the dirt, cheek pressed against ground that offered no comfort, and thought about how this was a stupid way to die. Not dramatic, not meaningful, just another drifter who took a wrong turn and ran out of luck. Her mother would have laughed. "You always did have more guts than sense, Clara girl." That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A voice. Rough, distant, barely cutting through the wind. Jesus Christ, hold on! Clara tried to lift her head, managed it maybe an inch before her strength gave out. Footsteps now, heavy and fast. A shape materialized out of the dust. Tall, broad-shouldered, more shadow than man. "Can you stand?" The voice was closer now, urgent but not panicked. Hands gripped her arms, firm but not rough. "We need to move. Now." "Can't," Clara managed. Her voice came out as gravel. "You can. Come on." He hauled her up with surprising gentleness for someone his size, getting one of her arms over his shoulders and half dragging, half carrying her through the storm. Clara's feet barely touched the ground. She caught glimpses of him through her dust-caked eyelashes, a worn hat pulled low, a jaw set with determination, the kind of weathered face that came from years of hard work and harder weather. "Not far," he said, more to himself than her. "Just a little further." Clara tried to help, tried to make her legs work, but they'd become distant things that only vaguely responded to instruction. The world tilted and swayed. She might have passed out. She wasn't sure. Reality had become something that happened in fragments, disconnected and strange. Then there was darkness of a different kind. Walls. A roof. The roar of the storm suddenly muffled, pushed back by 4 solid walls and a door that slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Clara collapsed the moment he let her go. She hit the floor, wood, not dirt, and just lay there, coughing and shaking and trying to remember how to breathe without inhaling half of Oklahoma. "Easy," that voice again. A hand on her back, steady and sure. "Easy now. You're all right." She wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. But the hand stayed there, grounding her until the coughing subsided and her breath came in ragged gasps instead of choking spasms. "Water," the man said. Footsteps crossing the room, the slosh of liquid. Then a tin cup pressed against her lips, and Clara drank like she'd never tasted water before. It was warm, tasted like metal. It was the best thing she'd ever had in her life. "Slow," the man warned, but Clara ignored him, gulping it down until he pulled the cup away. "You'll make yourself sick." "More," she croaked. He hesitated, then refilled the cup. This time she managed to pace herself, small sips that soothed her raw throat and washed away some of the dust. When the cup was empty again, she finally looked up at her rescuer. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe, though the lines around his eyes added years. Tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate little. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places. The kind of functional repairs you did yourself when there was no money for new. Dark hair, dark eyes, and an expression that suggested he didn't smile much anymore. "You got a name?" he asked. "Clara." It came out stronger this time. "Clara Hale." He nodded once. "Luke Mercer. This is my land, or what's left of it." Clara glanced around. They were in a barn, or what had been a barn before time and neglect got their teeth in it. The walls were solid enough, but the floor was covered in dust and old straw, and there were gaps in the boards that let in thin fingers of storm wind. No animals, no tools, just empty space and the smell of abandonment. "Lucky you found me," Clara said. "Lucky I came out to check the fence line." Luke settled back on his heels, studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Storm came up faster than I expected. Figured I'd wait it out here rather than try to make it back to the house." "Where's the house?" "Quarter-mile east." Clara laughed, and it hurt. "I walked past it." "Probably. Can't see your hand in front of your face out there." He stood, moved to a corner where a saddle and blanket were draped over a sawhorse. "Storm should blow through in an hour or two. You can rest here until then." He brought her the blanket, rough wool but dry and clean, and Clara wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. The shaking had started to subside, replaced by a bone-deep ache that suggested tomorrow was going to hurt like hell. "Thank you," she said quietly. Luke just nodded. He moved to the door, peered out through a crack in the boards at the howling dark beyond. His shoulders were tight, his whole body carrying a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. Clara watched him for a long moment. She'd gotten good at reading men over the years. Had to be, when your safety depended on knowing which ones would let you walk away and which ones wouldn't. Luke Mercer read as tired, worn down, like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "No." He didn't turn around. "Got a crew. Ranch hands." "Must be a big spread." "Was." That single word carried weight. Clara didn't push. She knew all about things that used to be. They sat in silence for a while, the storm raging outside, the barn creaking but holding. Clara's strength started to return in small increments, enough to sit up straighter, enough to take stock of her situation. Her bag was gone. Everything she owned had been in that bag, which wasn't much, but still. Gone now, claimed by the dust. She had the clothes on her back, an empty canteen, and a debt she couldn't pay. The debt bothered her more than the lost belongings. Clara Hale didn't like owing people. Owing meant obligation, and obligation meant staying, and staying was how you got trapped. But the man had saved her life. That wasn't the kind of thing you could just walk away from. "The ranch," she said finally. "You hiring?" Luke turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face before he could hide it. "Why?" "Because you saved my life, and I don't have money to pay you back." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Figure I could work off the debt instead." "You don't owe me anything." "I do, though." She pulled the blanket tighter. "That's how it works. You pull someone out of a dust storm, they owe you. I always pay my debts." Luke studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite hope, but maybe the ghost of it. Like he was looking at a door he'd thought was locked and realizing it might be open just a crack. "Can you cook?" he asked. The question surprised her. "Yeah, I can cook." "How well?" "Well enough that people usually ask me to stay." Which was true, even if Clara never did. "Why?" Luke turned back to the storm. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like he was picking his way through a minefield. "Lost our cook 3 months ago. Been making do since then, but it's not good. The men are hungry. Morale's in the dirt, and I—" He stopped, jaw working. "I can't afford to hire anyone." Clara understood then. This wasn't just about food. This was about a ranch that was dying, about men who'd stopped caring, about a man who was drowning and trying not to let anyone see. She should walk away. That was the smart play. Soon as the storm cleared, she should thank Luke Mercer for his kindness, point herself in a new direction, and disappear before this became her problem. But the debt sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. "1 meal," Clara heard herself say. "I'll cook your crew 1 meal. That squares us." Luke turned slowly. 1 meal? 1 meal to repay a life. Seems fair to me. She managed something that might have been a smile. "After that, I'm gone. You'll never see me again." He looked at her like he was trying to figure out if she was serious or crazy or both. Finally, he nodded. "All right, 1 meal." "All right." They shook on it, Clara's hand disappearing into his calloused grip. His hands were rough, the kind that came from rope and reins and 1,000 small repairs. Working hands, honest hands. She told herself she wasn't making a mistake. Oh. The storm blew through just after sunset, leaving behind a world scrubbed raw and strange. The air smelled like dust and ozone, and the sky had that peculiar clarity that came after violence. Stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Luke led her to the house through darkness so complete that Clara couldn't see the ground beneath her feet. She followed the sound of his footsteps and trusted he knew where he was going. After about 10 minutes of walking, a shape emerged from the night. A 2-story structure that had probably been impressive once, but now sagged like a tired old man. "Iron Ridge," Luke said quietly. "My father built it. His father before that." Clara could hear the weight in those words. This wasn't just a ranch. This was legacy, history, the accumulated hopes of generations. And it was dying. They climbed the steps to a wide porch that groaned under their weight. Luke pushed open the front door. It stuck, required a shoulder to unstick, and led her into a front room that smelled like dust and old smoke. He lit a lamp. Weak yellow light pushed back the dark, revealing a space that might have been grand once. High ceilings, good bones. But the furniture was sparse and worn, the walls bare of decoration, and there was that particular kind of emptiness that came from rooms where people used to gather but didn't anymore. "Men are probably asleep already," Luke said, setting the lamp on a table scarred with water rings and cigarette burns. "I'll show you the kitchen, then you can take the spare room upstairs." The kitchen was at the back of the house, accessed through a dining room with a long table that could have seated 20 but was set for 6. Clara followed Luke through the doorway and stopped dead. The kitchen was a disaster. Not just dirty. She'd seen dirty before. This was something else entirely. Pots crusted with days-old food, dishes stacked in a sink that hadn't seen water in recent memory, grease coating every surface, thick and stubborn. The stove looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months, maybe years. Flour dusted the floor. Something sticky had spilled near the icebox and never been wiped up. And the smell. The smell was what happened when you gave up on basic hygiene and let entropy take the wheel. Jesus, Clara breathed. Luke's jaw tightened. Like I said, been making do. Making do? Clara moved into the room, her boots sticking slightly to the floor. This isn't making do. This is... I don't even know what this is. You don't have to... One meal, Clara interrupted. That's the deal, but I can't cook in this. She turned to face him. I'll need at least a day to get this place functional. Maybe 2. Something flickered in Luke's eyes. Shame, maybe, or an anger at having a stranger see how far things had fallen. I'll help. You'll stay out of my way. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but Clara didn't take them back. She'd learned early that kitchens were kingdoms, and kingdoms needed clear rules. This is my space now, just for tomorrow. You want that meal? You let me work. For a moment she thought he might argue. Then Luke nodded once, turned, and walked out without another word. Clara stood alone in the ruined kitchen and wondered what the hell she'd gotten herself into. She started before dawn. The spare room Luke had showed her was clean, at least. A narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a window that looked out over darkness. Clara had slept in her clothes, too tired to care, and woke with every muscle screaming protest. The storm, the walking, the near-death experience, all of it sent bills that came due the moment she opened her eyes. She ignored it. Pain was just information, and the information said she was alive. That was enough. The kitchen looked worse in daylight. Clara stood in the doorway with a cup of weak coffee and assessed the battlefield. Where to even start? The scope of neglect was almost impressive. You had to work at ignoring a space this badly, had to actively choose day after day to let it get worse. She rolled up her sleeves. First, dishes. All of them. Clara heated water on the stove, which took 3 tries and some creative cursing to get lit, and filled the sink with water so hot it turned her hands pink. She scrubbed each pot, each plate, each piece of silverware until they gleamed. The water turned gray, then brown, then black. She dumped it and started over. And over again. While the dishes dried, she tackled the stove, scraped off months of accumulated grease and burnt food, scrubbed the iron grates until her shoulders ached and her fingers cramped. The stove fought her every step, but Clara was stubborn, and the stove was just metal. By noon, it looked almost respectable. The counters were next, then the floor, then the shelves where she found food that should have been thrown out weeks ago. Moldy bread, rancid lard, vegetables that had liquefied in their crates. She hauled it all outside to a compost heap that hadn't been turned in God knew how long and tried not to think about how much waste this represented. Men came and went through the dining room while she worked. She caught glimpses of them, lean, hard-faced, watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been hope. None of them spoke to her. That was fine. Clara didn't need conversation. She needed this kitchen to stop being an insult to cooking. Luke appeared around 2 in the afternoon, carrying a crate of supplies. "Took the wagon into town," he said, setting the crate on the now-clean counter. "Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, some fresh vegetables. It's not much, but it's good." Clara sorted through the crate, mentally cataloging what she could do with this. Not a lot, but enough. "You got meat? Chickens? A few eggs? Might be able to spare a hen. Salt pork?" Luke nodded. "In the cellar." "Show me." The cellar was dark and smelled like earth and old potatoes. Luke led her down narrow steps to a space carved out of Oklahoma clay and lined with shelves that held the remnants of better times. Jars of preserved vegetables, their contents questionable. Sacks of grain, some showing signs of weevils. And hanging from hooks in the ceiling, salt pork wrapped in muslin. Clara examined it critically. Old, but still good. She could work with this. "How many men?" she asked. 7, counting me. "Everyone eat together?" "Used to. Not so much anymore." Clara pulled down 2 slabs of pork, considering. They will tomorrow. She worked through the night, not because she had to, but because sleep felt like giving up, and Clara Hale didn't give up on food. Food was the one thing she'd always been good at, the one skill that followed her from town to town and never let her down. Some people had music, some had words. Clara had cooking, and when she cooked, something in her that was usually wound tight finally relaxed. The kitchen became hers in the dark hours. She moved through it with growing confidence, learning its rhythms and quirks. The stove ran hot on the right side. The pump for the sink needed 3 hard cranks before water would flow. The good knives were buried under junk in the bottom drawer, and they were dull, but she could fix that. She started with the beans, soaked them in water with a little salt and a ham hock from the cellar. While they softened, she worked on bread. Her hands remembered the rhythms even when her brain was fuzzy with exhaustion. Mix, knead, let rise. The repetition was meditative, grounding. Flour dusted her arms up to the elbows. Her back ached from standing. She didn't care. The beans went into a pot to simmer. The bread went into the oven. Clara moved to the pork, cutting it into thick slabs and rendering the fat in a cast-iron skillet that weighed 10 pounds if it weighed an ounce. The smell filled the kitchen, rich, savory, alive. Somewhere in those hours, a man appeared in the doorway. Not Luke. This one was older, stockier, with a face like granite, and eyes that assessed her with the cold calculation of someone used to being in charge. "You the cook?" he asked. "For tonight." Clara didn't look up from the onions she was slicing. "You got a problem with that?" "Depends on if you can cook." "Guess you'll find out." The man grunted. "Name's Briggs, foreman here." Now Clara did look up. Briggs. Luke hadn't mentioned a foreman, but the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin up, taking up space like it belonged to him, said everything she needed to know. This was the man who ran the day-to-day, which meant this was the man who'd let the kitchen fall apart. "Clara Hale," she said evenly. "You planning on staying?" "Planning on cooking a meal. After that, we'll see." Briggs studied her for a long moment. Clara had been studied by men like him before, men who thought they could read you, categorize you, decide what you were worth. She met his gaze steadily and didn't blink. Finally, Briggs smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Kitchen's been empty for 3 months. Good luck making anything edible out of what's left." He turned and walked away before she could respond. Clara went back to her onions. Her hands were shaking slightly, but whether from anger or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. Probably both. To hell with him. To hell with all of them. She'd show them what empty could become. Dawn arrived with light that turned the prairie gold. Clara plated the food with hands that had gone past tired into that strange floating space where you weren't quite attached to your body anymore. Beans and salt pork, slow cooked until the meat fell apart and the beans were creamy and rich. Fresh bread, still warm, with butter she'd churned from cream Luke had brought from town. Fried eggs, the yolks runny, seasoned with pepper and salt. And coffee. Real coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't complicated, but it was honest food, made with care, and Clara knew, the way you know things in your bones, that it was good. She rang the bell mounted by the back door. The sound carried across the yard, sharp and clear. Within minutes, men started appearing. They came slowly, skeptically, like animals that had been baited too many times to trust easy promises. 7 of them, including Luke and Briggs. They filed into the dining room and stopped, staring at the table she'd set. Clean plates, real silverware. Food steaming in serving dishes. The smell alone was probably enough to make grown men weep. "Sit," Clara said from the doorway. They sat, slowly, watching her like she might be a trick or a trap. Luke took the head of the table. Briggs sat at his right hand, a position of power, Clara noted. The others filled in around them, young and old, sun-dark and scarred, all of them carrying the particular kind of wariness that came from not having enough. "Help yourselves," Clara said. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the youngest one, couldn't have been more than 19, reached for the bread. The spell broke. Hands moved, plates filled, and the dining room went quiet in the way rooms do when food is the only thing that matters. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. She saw the moment it hit them. That first bite that told them this wasn't survival food, wasn't fuel to get through another day. This was something else. This was care translated into flavor, attention made edible. The young one closed his eyes. An older man with gray in his beard made a sound that was almost a moan. Even Briggs, stone-faced Briggs, went still for a moment, his expression unreadable. And Luke! Luke ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd forgotten what it meant to taste instead of just consume. Clara saw his shoulders drop slightly, tension bleeding out with every bite. When he looked up and caught her watching, something passed between them. Not quite gratitude. Something more complicated than that. "Miss Hale!" Briggs's voice cut through the quiet. He'd cleaned his plate and was eyeing the serving dishes like a man considering his options. "This is adequate." "Adequate." Clara almost laughed. "Adequate my ass," the young one said. "This is the best meal I've had in a year." Murmurs of agreement around the table. Even the quiet ones nodded. Briggs's jaw tightened. "Like I said, adequate." He stood, scraping his chair back with more force than necessary. "Thanks for the meal. Hope the next person can match it." He walked out without another word, letting the door slam behind him. The silence that followed was brittle, fragile. Clara watched Luke's face close off, watched the other men exchange glances that said more than words ever could. There was a dynamic here, a power structure she didn't fully understand yet, but could feel like weather rolling in. "Don't mind Briggs," the young one said quietly. "He's just—" "Shut it, Tommy." An older hand grabbed his arm. "Not our business." Tommy shut it. They finished eating in near silence. One by one, they brought their plates to the kitchen, mumbled thanks Clara barely heard, and filed out into the morning. Luke stayed, nursing his coffee, staring at something only he could see. Clara started cleaning up. The work was familiar, soothing. Scrape, stack, wash. The rhythm let her think. One meal. That was the deal. Her debt was paid. She could walk away now with a clear conscience, find the next town, the next job, the next temporary stop on a road that never ended. But something had shifted. She'd seen it in their faces, the way that food had cut through their armor, made them human again for 20 minutes. And she'd felt it too, that old satisfaction that came from feeding people who needed feeding. Dangerous, that feeling. Dangerous to care. "You're good at this." Luke's voice startled her out of her thoughts. Claire glanced over her shoulder. He'd moved to the doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "It's just food," she said. "No." He shook his head slowly. "It's not. What you did, that was the first time in months I've seen the men look like men instead of ghosts. That matters." Clara turned back to the dishes. "Your foreman didn't seem impressed." "Briggs," Luke sighed. "Briggs has his own way of doing things. He doesn't like change. He doesn't like me. He doesn't know you. Neither do you." Luke didn't respond to that. Clara finished the dishes in silence, dried her hands on a towel that had seen better days, and turned to face him properly. "One meal," she said. "That was the deal. We're square now." "We are. So I should go." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "You should," he agreed. "But you won't." The certainty in his voice sent a flicker of irritation through her. "You don't know that." "Maybe not." He set his cup down carefully. "But I know desperation when I see it. And I know that look you get when you're cooking, like it's the only thing keeping you tethered to the ground. So maybe you should go. But I don't think you will." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she didn't need this place any more than it needed her. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy and impossible. Because he was right. Damn him, he was right. She thought about walking away from this kitchen she'd just spent a day and a night bringing back to life. Thought about leaving these men to slide back into whatever half-alive existence they'd been living before. Thought about Luke, standing alone in this dying ranch, watching everything his family built crumble to dust. It wasn't her problem. These weren't her people. This wasn't her fight. But that meal, that had been hers. The food, the care, the way it had changed the air in that dining room from resignation to something that might have been hope. That had been all her, and walking away from it felt like leaving part of herself behind. "I could stay," Clara heard herself say. "For a while. A week, maybe. Get your kitchen properly sorted. Teach someone else to cook, if you've got anyone willing to learn. Luke's expression didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed. I can't pay you. I know. The ranch is barely holding on. We're one bad season from losing everything. If you stay, you're betting on a losing hand. Story of my life. That got the ghost of a smile from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. All right then, a week. They shook on it again. Clara's hand in his, sealing a deal that felt bigger than it should, more permanent than a week had any right to be. She told herself it was just a week, told herself she could walk away after, told herself she wasn't already starting to care about this place, these people, this broken man trying to hold everything together with nothing but stubborn pride. She'd always been good at lying to herself. The week turned into 2, then 3, and Clara stopped counting days. She told herself it was because the kitchen still needed work. And it did. Always something that needed fixing or organizing or scrubbing clean. But the truth sat heavier than that. The truth was, she'd started to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous and seductive that whispered maybe this time could be different. She ignored it, kept her head down and her hands busy, cooked 3 meals a day for men who ate like they'd forgotten food could taste like anything but obligation. Slowly, grudgingly, the kitchen became what it should have been all along, functional, clean, a place where nourishment happened instead of just survival. The men noticed. They started showing up earlier for meals, lingering over coffee, talking in low voices about things that had nothing to do with work. Tommy, the young one with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger than 19, started helping with dishes without being asked. An older hand named Rayford brought her wild onions he'd found growing by the creek. Even Silent Pete, who hadn't spoken more than 3 words since she'd arrived, nodded at her once when she passed him bread still warm from the oven. Small things, quiet things. But they added up to something that felt almost like belonging. Briggs, though. Briggs was a different story. He watched her. Not obviously, not in a way she could call him out on, but she felt his eyes tracking her movements whenever he was near. He never complained about the food, couldn't really, not when the other men made it clear they'd riot if she left. But he didn't thank her either, just ate in silence, his expression carved from stone, radiating disapproval like heat from a stove. Clara tried to ignore him, tried to tell herself it didn't matter what one man thought when the rest were coming back to life bite by bite, meal by meal. But Briggs was the foreman, and the foreman's opinion carried weight whether she liked it or not. It came to a head on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into what was supposed to be a 1-week stay. Clara had risen before dawn like always, started the coffee, begun mixing biscuit dough while the stove heated. The kitchen was her sanctuary in these early hours, just her and the work and the slowly lightening sky visible through the window. No one to perform for, no one to prove anything to, just the honest simplicity of flour and fat and salt becoming something more. She was cutting biscuits when boots sounded in the dining room. Too early for breakfast. Too heavy to be Tommy or one of the younger hands. Briggs appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his face shadowed in the pre-dawn gray. "We need to talk," he said. Clara kept cutting biscuits. "I'm working." "This can't wait." She looked up then, really looked at him. Briggs was maybe 50, built like a man who'd spent his whole life doing hard labor and had the scars to prove it. His hands were gnarled, knuckles swollen from old breaks that hadn't healed right. There was a hardness to him that went bone deep, the kind that came from years of making difficult choices and living with the consequences. "All right," Claire said, "talk." Briggs glanced toward the dining room, checking they were alone. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful. "You're causing problems." "I'm cooking." "You're making the men soft." He stepped into the kitchen, and suddenly the space felt smaller. They're spending more time thinking about their next meal than their next task. They're distracted, unfocused, and that's dangerous on a ranch that's barely holding together. Clara set down her biscuit cutter with deliberate care. They're eating. For the first time in months, they're actually eating real food instead of whatever slop was passing for meals before I got here. That's not making them soft. That's keeping them alive. They were alive before you showed up. Were they? The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Because from where I'm standing, they looked half dead, moving through the days like ghosts, no hope, no energy, nothing to look forward to but more of the same. That's not living, Briggs. That's just not dying yet. His jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Clara wiped flour from her hands and faced him fully. I've been drifting for 10 years. Worked ranches from here to California and back again. I know what a crew looks like when they've given up, and that's exactly what yours looked like when I got here. So maybe you don't like me, and maybe you don't like change, but those men are coming back to life, and you're going to have to deal with it. For a long moment, Briggs just stared at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or something deeper. Fear, possibly. Fear of what it meant if she was right, if things really had gotten that bad under his watch. Luke's making a mistake keeping you here, he said finally. Maybe, but it's his mistake to make. Is it? Briggs took another step closer. He wasn't threatening exactly, but his presence filled the space in a way that made Clara's muscles tense. Because when this place falls apart, and it will fall apart, it'll be on all of us. Not just Luke. Every man here is tied to this ranch, and when it goes under, we go with it. You think feeding them fancy meals changes that? I think, Clara said slowly, that men work harder when they've got something to work for. Right now, they've got a hot meal waiting at the end of the day. That's more than they had a month ago. A hot meal, Briggs laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think that's enough? This ranch is drowning in debt. The cattle are barely worth the cost of feeding them. We've got equipment breaking down faster than we can fix it, and not enough hands to work the land properly. A hot meal doesn't fix any of that. No, Clara admitted. It doesn't, but it gives them a reason to care about fixing it themselves. Briggs studied her for another long moment. Then he shook his head and turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused without looking back. You're going to break their hearts when you leave, he said quietly. And they've had enough broken around here already. He walked out before she could respond. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. She picked up the biscuit cutter and went back to work, but the rhythm was off now, the peace shattered. Because Briggs was right about one thing, she was going to leave. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. She always did. The biscuits burned. First time in 3 weeks she'd ruined a batch, and it felt like failure. Later that morning, Luke found her scrubbing the stove with more force than necessary, taking her frustration out on grease that had been there for years and wasn't going anywhere. Briggs talked to you, he said. Not a question. He did. What'd he say? Clara didn't stop scrubbing. That I'm making the men soft, that I'm a distraction, that the ranch is dying and I'm just delaying the inevitable. Luke leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He looked tired today, older than his years. There were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met, or maybe Clara was just noticing them now. He's not entirely wrong, Luke said. That made her stop. She turned to look at him, rag still in hand. About which part? The ranch dying. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. We're 2 months behind on the banknote, lost half the herd to disease last winter. And the land... He gestured vaguely toward the window. The land's played out. Too many years of drought, too much grazing. It'll take a decade to recover, and we don't have a decade. Clara set down the rag. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you're staying for. Luke pushed off from the doorframe and walked into the kitchen properly. Up close, she could see the exhaustion written in every line of his body. Briggs thinks you're going to leave and break everyone's heart. Maybe he's right. But I'd rather you know the truth and leave now than stay out of pity and leave later when it's worse. I don't do pity, Clara said. No, I don't think you do. He smiled slightly. But you do guilt, and that's almost worse. The observation hit closer than Clara liked. She turned back to the stove, needing something to do with her hands. So what happens when the bank comes calling? I don't know. Luke's voice was quiet. Sell what we can. Let the men go. Walk away from everything my family built and try to start over somewhere else. He paused. Or fight. Find some way to make this work. Keep it together through sheer stubbornness, if nothing else. Which one are you planning on? Haven't decided yet. Clara scrubbed at a spot that was probably permanent by now, working it over and over while her mind spun. She thought about her bag still sitting in the spare room upstairs, packed and ready because she never fully unpacked. Thought about how easy it would be to grab it and walk out that door. point herself toward the next town, and let Iron Ridge become just another story she didn't tell. But she also thought about Tommy's face when he ate her cornbread, about Rayford bringing her those wild onions like they were treasure, about 7 men who'd started to hope again because someone had bothered to feed them properly. And she thought about Luke standing in this kitchen trying to decide between surrender and a fight he couldn't win. "The men," Clara said finally. "How loyal are they?" "To the ranch? To me?" Luke considered. "Mixed. Some have been here for years, some are just passing through, working until they can find something better. Why? Because if you're going to fight, you need people who'll fight with you. Not for a paycheck, but because they actually give a damn about this place." She turned to face him. "You can't do it alone." "I know that." "Do you?" Clara crossed her arms. "Because from where I'm standing, you're carrying all of this by yourself. Making decisions alone, worrying alone, planning alone. Even Briggs. He's your foreman, but does he actually help? Or does he just run the day-to-day while you handle all the hard parts?" Luke's expression shifted, something uncomfortable crossing his face. "It's complicated." "It always is." Clara moved closer, studying him. "How long has it been like this? The ranch struggling, I mean." 3 years since my father died." Luke's voice went flat. "He had a stroke out in the north pasture. By the time we found him, it was too late. Left everything to me. The land, the debt, all of it. I was supposed to save it, make it work somehow." "And Briggs?" "Was my father's foreman. Been here 20 years. Knows this ranch better than anyone." Luke rubbed his face tiredly. "He thinks I'm too soft, that I should have cut the crew in half, sold off the cattle, focused on just keeping the land. Maybe he's right." "Maybe he's wrong," Clara said. "Maybe what this place needs isn't less people. It's people who actually want to be here. People who will work harder because they're invested, not because they're scared of losing their job." Luke looked at her skeptically. "And how do you create that?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I know it doesn't happen when everyone's half-starved and miserable. It starts with the basics: food, rest, feeling like you matter. You've got the food covered now. What about the rest? We work 12-hour days, sometimes more. There's always something that needs doing. And when was the last time anyone took a real break? Had a night off? Did something that wasn't work?" Luke opened his mouth, then closed it. The answer was clearly never, or close enough that it didn't matter. Clara nodded slowly. "That's your problem. You're running them into the ground and wondering why they don't care about saving this place. People need reasons to fight, Luke. Real reasons. Not just obligation or fear." "So what do you suggest?" She hadn't expected him to actually ask. Clara paused, considering. An idea was forming, rough and half-baked, but it had potential. "Sunday," she said. "Give them Sunday off, real off, not just a half day where they still have to do evening chores. Let them rest, maybe go into town if they want. And we'll have a proper dinner that night, something special. Make it clear that this is their place too, not just yours. We can't afford to lose a full day of work." "Can you afford to lose the men?" Clara countered. "Because that's what's happening. Slowly, quietly, they're checking out. And when the real crisis hits, when you need them to go above and beyond, they won't, because they don't have anything left to give." Luke was quiet for a long time. Outside, Clara could hear the ranch waking up, boots on the porch, voices calling out, the sound of horses being led to the corral. Normal morning sounds on a ranch that was anything but normal. "All right," Luke said finally. "Sunday. We'll try it your way." "Good. But Clara..." He caught her arm gently as she turned to leave. "This doesn't fix the real problem. The debt, the land, all of it. Sunday dinners are nice, but they don't keep the bank from foreclosing." "I know," Clara said. "But it's a start. And sometimes that's all you can do. Start and see where it takes you." She pulled free and went back to her stove, to her rag, to the familiar comfort of work. Behind her, she heard Luke leave, and she tried not to think about how much easier it would be to walk away now, before she got any more tangled up in this place and these people and their impossible situation. But her bag stayed upstairs, unpacked as ever. And Sunday came. The men didn't know what to make of it at first. Luke announced it at breakfast on Saturday. Tomorrow was a day off, full day, no work expected. And the silence that followed was almost comical. A day off, Tommy repeated, like he'd never heard the words before. That's what I said. Luke's voice was gruff, uncomfortable with the attention. Clara thought you all could use a break. I agreed. Briggs's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He looked at Clara with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. Then he went back to eating without comment. We can go into town, Rayford asked carefully. If you want, or stay here and rest, your choice. The younger hands exchanged glances, excitement flickering in their eyes. Even the older ones looked interested, though they tried to hide it. A day off was rare enough to be precious, something to be treasured and planned for. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway and felt that dangerous warmth spreading through her chest again. This was what she'd wanted, to see them alive, engaged, caring about something beyond just getting through another day. But it also meant she'd succeeded, which meant she was running out of excuses to stay. Sunday morning arrived quiet and strange. The ranch felt different without the usual sounds of work. No hammering from the barn, no cattle being moved, no men calling out to each other across the yard. Just silence and sunshine and the lazy buzz of insects in the grass. Claire spent the day in the kitchen, preparing. She'd convinced Luke to spare a chicken, a young one, plump and healthy, and she'd been planning this meal in her head for days. Roasted chicken with herbs she'd gathered from the scrubland near the creek, mashed potatoes with real butter and cream, green beans cooked slow with bacon, biscuits that actually rose properly, and for dessert, a dried apple pie made from fruit Luke had brought back from his last town trip. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious given what she had to work with. But Clara had never been one to aim small. She worked through the afternoon, losing herself in the familiar rhythms. The kitchen was hot, the stove radiating heat that made sweat run down her back. But she didn't mind. This was her element, where everything made sense and effort translated directly into results. Around 4, Tommy appeared in the doorway, cleaner than she'd ever seen him. He'd clearly bathed and changed clothes, his red hair slicked back with water. Need any help, Miss Clara? He asked. You're supposed to be resting. I am resting. Just thought I'd rest in here if that's all right. Clara smiled despite herself. Fine. You can start peeling potatoes. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Clara tending the chicken while Tommy attacked a pile of potatoes with more enthusiasm than skill. He was young enough that everything still seemed like an adventure, even potato peeling. Miss Clara? He said after a bit. Can I ask you something? Depends on the question. Why'd you stay? I mean, I'm glad you did, but you were only supposed to cook one meal. That was weeks ago. Clara checked the chicken, buying herself time. Why had she stayed? The real answer was complicated and uncomfortable, involving things like loneliness and purpose and the way Luke looked at her sometimes like she might actually be able to help. Guess I felt like the job wasn't finished yet, she said finally. What job? The cooking? Something like that. Tommy accepted this non-answer with the easy grace of youth. Well, I'm glad. Things are better with you here. Even Briggs thinks so, though he'd never say it. Briggs thinks I'm a problem. Briggs thinks everything's a problem. Tommy grinned. But I've seen him eat your food. Man who hates you doesn't clean his plate like that. Clara had to laugh at that logic. Fair point. They finished the preparations as the sun started its slow descent toward the horizon. The other men trickled back from town or wherever they'd spent the day, drawn by the smell of cooking and the promise of Clara's Sunday dinner. They gathered in the dining room, talking and laughing in a way she hadn't heard before. Easy conversation between people who actually liked each other, not just men forced together by circumstance. Luke appeared last, cleaned up and looking less burdened than usual. He caught Clara's eye across the room and nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement and maybe gratitude. All right, Clara called out. Everyone sit. Food's ready. They sat. She served, moving from plate to plate, making sure everyone got equal portions. The chicken was perfect, golden brown, the skin crispy, and the meat tender. The potatoes were fluffy and rich. Even the pie, which she'd worried might be too dry, had turned out better than expected. The first bites brought the familiar silence of men too focused on eating to talk. Then the compliments started rolling in, genuine and heartfelt. Best chicken I've ever had, Rayford declared. Better than my mama's, and don't tell her I said that, another hand added. Even Silent Pete made a sound that might have been approval. Briggs ate without comment, but Clara noticed he took seconds and thirds. After the meal, after the dishes were cleared and the pie devoured down to crumbs, the men lingered. Someone produced a harmonica. Someone else started singing, rough but honest. The dining room filled with music and laughter and the rare, precious feeling of people who'd forgotten how to be happy, slowly remembering. Clara cleaned in the kitchen, listening to it all through the doorway. This was what she'd wanted, this warmth, this life, this proof that broken things could be repaired with enough patience and care. But it also hurt, because she knew it couldn't last. Moments like this never did. You did good. Luke's voice startled her. He'd appeared in the doorway, 2 plates in hand. They needed this. They needed more than a good meal. Maybe, but it's a start, like you said. He set the plates by the sink and moved to help her dry. You know, when you first showed up, I thought you were just another drifter passing through, someone who'd stay a few days and disappear. I am just a drifter passing through. Are you? Luke looked at her directly. Because it's been 3 weeks, Clara, and you're still here, still cooking, still fighting with Briggs, still finding ways to make this place a little less broken. That doesn't sound like passing through to me. Clara focused on his plate in her hands, scrubbing at a spot that was already clean. Don't read too much into it. I'll leave eventually. I always do. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Why did she leave? Because staying meant getting attached. Because attachment meant vulnerability. Because every time she'd tried to build something permanent, it had fallen apart. And she'd learned the hard way that the only person you could count on was yourself. Because that's who I am, she said finally. I'm not the settling down type, Luke, never have been. People can change. Can they? Clara set the plate down and turned to face him. You grew up here, right? This ranch, this land, it's all you've ever known. You've got roots so deep you couldn't pull them up if you tried. But me? I don't have roots. I have motion. And the second I stop moving, the second I try to plant myself somewhere, things go bad. That's a hell of a way to live. It's the only way I know. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the harmonica played on, a mournful tune that fit the mood better than Clara liked. You're scared, he said finally. The words hit like a slap. Excuse me? You're scared of staying, of caring, of letting people in. So you keep moving, keep telling yourself it's who you are, when really it's just what you do to avoid getting hurt. Clara's hands clenched into fists. You don't know me well enough to make that call. Maybe not, but I know scared when I see it. Luke's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. I've been scared every day since my father died. Scared of failing, of losing this place, of letting down everyone who depends on me. So yeah, I recognize it in someone else. That's different. Is it? He moved closer, and Clara had to resist the urge to step back. We're both running, Clara. You run from place to place. I run from one crisis to the next. Different methods, same result, neither of us actually dealing with what we're afraid of. And what am I afraid of since you've got me all figured out? Being happy, Luke said simply. Being somewhere you actually want to be. Because if you let yourself be happy, you might have to admit that you deserve it. And for some reason, you don't think you do. The accuracy of it stole her breath. Clara turned away, hands shaking as she picked up another plate just to have something to do. You should get back to your men. Clara is... I said get back to your men. Her voice came out sharper than intended. Sunday's your day off, too. Don't waste it in here with me. Luke hesitated. For a moment, Clara thought he might push, might keep digging at wounds she'd spent years learning to ignore. But then he nodded once and left, leaving her alone with the dishes and the truth she didn't want to face. She was happy here. That was the problem. These 3 weeks at Iron Ridge had been the closest thing to peace she'd felt in a decade. And that scared her more than any dust storm or hostile foreman or dying ranch ever could. Because happy meant vulnerable, happy meant caring, and caring meant it would hurt like hell when it all fell apart. And it would fall apart. It always did. Clara finished the dishes in silence, dried everything and put it away with mechanical precision, then climbed the stairs to her room. Her bag sat in the corner where it always sat, ready and waiting. She could pack it tonight, leave at first light, be 3 towns away before anyone realized she was gone. She should do exactly that. Instead, she lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to music and laughter drift up from downstairs, and tried to remember the last time walking away had felt this hard. She didn't leave at first light. Didn't leave the next day either. A week passed, then another, and Clara stopped pretending she had a plan. The bag stayed in the corner, and she stayed in the kitchen, and neither of them went anywhere. But something had shifted after that Sunday dinner. The ranch felt different, or maybe Clara was just paying closer attention. She noticed things she'd missed before, how Briggs and Luke barely spoke during meals, communicating in nods and silences that suggested years of unresolved tension. How the younger hands deferred to the older ones in ways that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with fear. How the whole place operated under an unspoken rule that no one questioned anything because questioning meant change, and change was dangerous. It was Tommy who finally broke the pattern. He appeared in the kitchen one afternoon, hat in hand, looking nervous in a way that made Clara set down her knife and pay attention. "Miss Clara, can I ask you something?" He'd asked her things before, but this felt different. More serious. "Go ahead. Is it true the bank's coming? That they might take the ranch?" Clara's stomach dropped. She'd known the men had to suspect something. You couldn't hide that kind of desperation forever. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Where'd you hear that?" she asked carefully. "Rayford. He was in town last week, heard people talking." Tommy twisted his hat between his hands. "They're saying Luke's got till end of summer to pay up, or they're foreclosing. That true?" Clara could have lied. Should have lied, probably. Told him it was just gossip and not to worry. But Tommy's eyes were earnest and trusting, and she'd never been good at lying to people who actually deserved the truth. "I don't know the details," she said. "But yeah, the ranch is in trouble. Has been for a while." Tommy's face fell. "We gonna lose our jobs?" "I don't know that either." "What's Luke gonna do?" "You'd have to ask him." But Tommy shook his head quickly. "Can't ask him. He doesn't talk about it. None of the bosses do. They just keep working us like nothing's wrong, like if we pretend hard enough it'll all be fine." He looked at Clara with something close to desperation. "But it won't be fine, will it?" "No," Clara said quietly. "Probably not." The honesty seemed to hurt him, but he also looked relieved, like confirming his fears was better than living with uncertainty. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. Clara didn't have an answer. She was a cook, not a rancher, and her knowledge of cattle operations and bank loans and land management could fit in a teaspoon with room left over. But she also knew people, knew desperation, knew what it looked like when someone was drowning and too proud to ask for help. "Talk to Luke," she said finally. "Tell him what you heard. Tell him the men are scared and they deserve to know what's happening." "He won't listen to me." "Then make him listen." Tommy left looking unconvinced, but something had been set in motion. That evening at dinner, Clara watched the dynamics more carefully. Saw how the men ate in near silence, throwing glances at Luke and Briggs like they wanted to say something but didn't dare. Saw how Luke kept his eyes on his plate, shoulders tight with the weight of everything he wasn't saying. Saw how Briggs watched everyone with that calculating expression, always assessing, always judging. It couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. The breaking point came 3 days later on a morning that started ordinary and went bad fast. Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard shouting from the yard. Male voices, angry, the kind of anger that came from fear and frustration boiling over. She moved to the window and saw Luke and Briggs facing off near the barn, both of them red-faced and gesturing sharply. "Can't keep pretending," Briggs's voice carried across the yard. "The men know something's wrong. They're not stupid." "I'll handle it." Luke's response was quieter, but no less intense. "When? When the bank shows up to evict us? When we're packing our gear with nowhere to go?" Briggs stepped closer, aggressive. "You've been saying you'll handle it for months, Luke, but nothing changes. Nothing gets better. We're bleeding out and you're putting bandages on bullet wounds." "So what do you suggest?" Luke's voice had gone cold. "Sell everything? Give up?" "I suggest we face reality. This ranch can't support 7 men anymore. Maybe not even 5. We need to cut crew, sell the cattle while they're still worth something, and focus on keeping the land. At least then we'd have something to rebuild with. Those men have families, lives. I'm not throwing them out because things got hard. They'll be thrown out anyway when the bank takes over, Briggs was shouting now. At least this way they'd have time to find something else instead of getting blindsided when we go under. Clara's hands clenched on the windowsill. She should stay out of this, should let them fight it out without interference. But something in Luke's face, the desperate, cornered look of a man with no good options, made her move. She was out the door and across the yard before she'd fully decided to intervene. "That's enough," she said, stepping between them. Both men turned to stare at her. Briggs looked furious at the interruption. Luke just looked tired. "This doesn't concern you," Briggs said. "The hell it doesn't. I cook for these men. I see them every day. And if you think they don't already know something's wrong, you're fooling yourself. Stay out of ranch business, Clara." It became my business when I started caring about whether these people survived the month. She turned to Luke. "Is it true? The bank's foreclosing?" Luke's jaw worked. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he nodded once, sharp and defeated. "End of August. 2 months." His voice was flat. "If we can't make the payment by then, they take everything." "How much?" $1,200. The number hung in the air like a sentence. $1,200 might as well have been 12,000 for all the chance a dying ranch had of raising it. "Where are you at now?" Clara asked. 400. Maybe. Luke rubbed his face. "Had to use most of our operating capital to buy feed through the winter. Haven't recovered. So you need 800 more in 2 months. Give or take." Briggs laughed bitterly. "See? Impossible. Which is why we need to start making hard choices now, before the choice gets made for us." Clara's mind was racing. $800, 2 months, a crew of 7 men and a herd of cattle that were apparently barely worth the cost of keeping them. The math didn't work, not even close. But she'd never been good at accepting impossible. "What about a drive?" she asked. Both men looked at her like she'd spoken a different language. "A what?" Luke said. "A cattle drive. Take the herd to market yourself instead of waiting for buyers to come here. Cut out the middleman. Get better prices." Clara had heard cowboys talk about drives over the years, back when she'd worked other ranches. Risky, dangerous, but potentially profitable if you could pull it off. Briggs shook his head. "Drives haven't been profitable in years. Too expensive, too many things can go wrong. And with our herd in the shape it's in—" "What shape is it in?" Clara interrupted. "Thin, half sick from bad feed. We'd lose a quarter of them before we made it 50 miles. So fatten them up first." "With what money?" Briggs' voice was sharp with frustration. "You think feed just appears out of thin air? We're already stretched so tight we're skipping maintenance on equipment we can't afford to replace." "Then find better grazing. Move them to fresh pasture. Let them recover naturally." Clara was making this up as she went, pulling from fragments of conversation she'd overheard over the years. How much better could you get for them if they were actually healthy? Luke and Briggs exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, a calculation Clara couldn't quite read. "Maybe 20% more," Luke said slowly. "If they were in good condition and we could get them to the right market." "And would that 20% make up the difference?" Another pause. Luke's expression shifted, something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes before he could crush it. "It might," he admitted. "But Briggs is right. Drives are risky. We'd need supplies, fresh horses, time to prep. And if something went wrong, if we lost the herd or couldn't make the timeline, we'd be worse off than before." "You're worse off than before anyway," Clara said bluntly. "Right now you're sitting here waiting to die. At least this way you'd be doing something." Briggs stepped forward, his face dark. "This is insane. You're a cook, not a rancher. You don't know what you're talking about." "You're right. I don't." Clara met his glare without flinching. "But I know when someone's given up, and I know the difference between a bad plan and no plan at all. Right now you've got no plan except hope the bank changes its mind, which we all know isn't happening." "A drive could kill us," Briggs said flatly. "Kill the herd, kill our last chance, kill any hope of keeping this place running. You want that on your conscience? Better than watching you all slowly starve while pretending everything's fine." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling through dead grass. Clara could feel her heart hammering, adrenaline singing through her veins. She'd overstepped badly. This wasn't her ranch, wasn't her decision, wasn't even her fight. But she'd made it her fight anyway, and now she had to live with the consequences. Luke looked at Briggs. "What do you think?" I think it's suicide. But Briggs's voice had lost some of its edge. He was actually considering it, Clara realized. Despite all his objections, some part of him was running the numbers, weighing the risks. But, Luke prompted. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. But if we're going to try something desperate, better to do it now while we still have resources. Wait till the last minute and we won't have the capital to even attempt it. So you think we should do it? I think we're damned either way. At least this way we're doing something. Briggs looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Even if the idea came from someone who doesn't know a longhorn from a milk cow. It wasn't approval exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. Luke nodded slowly. All right, we'll put it to the men. If they're willing to risk it, we move forward. If not, he trailed off, but the unspoken end of that sentence hung heavy. If not, they were finished. The meeting happened that night after dinner. Luke called everyone into the dining room and laid it out plain. The debt, the deadline, the choices they had. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, trying to stay invisible, but she could feel eyes on her. The men knew this had been her idea. For better or worse, she'd set this in motion. It's not a sure thing, Luke was saying. Even if everything goes right, we might not make enough. And if things go wrong, storm, stampede, buyers backing out, we could lose everything. We're going to lose everything anyway, Rayford said. He was one of the oldest hands, grizzled and tough as boot leather. At least this way we go down fighting. Murmurs of agreement around the table. Tommy nodded vigorously. Even Silent Pete made a sound that might have been assent. It's dangerous, Briggs said. His voice carried warning. Some of you haven't done a real drive before. Don't know what it's like when things go bad. And they will go bad. They always do. So we'll learn. Tommy's voice was young and confident in that way only youth could manage. Better than sitting here waiting. More nods. The energy in the room was shifting, fear transmuting into something that looked almost like determination. Luke looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes in turn. Anyone wants out, now's the time to say so. No judgment. But if we do this, I need everyone committed. Can't have people doubting when we're 50 miles from home with 1,000 head of cattle and a storm coming. Silence. Heavy and expectant. Then Rayford spoke up. I'm in. Me too, Tommy said immediately. One by one, the others voiced agreement. Even the quieter ones, the ones who usually just went along with whatever was decided, spoke up with something that sounded like conviction. Finally, all eyes turned to Briggs. The foreman sat still, his weathered face unreadable. Clara held her breath. This whole thing hinged on him, his experience, his knowledge, his ability to actually make it work. Without Briggs, they were just desperate men with a bad idea. It's going to be hell, Briggs said finally. We'll work harder than we've ever worked. Sleep less, hurt more, and probably end up hating each other by the end. And there's a good chance we fail anyway. He paused, and Clara's heart sank. But yeah, Briggs continued, I'm in. Someone's got to make sure you idiots don't get yourselves killed. The room erupted in noise. Not quite celebration, but something close. Relief mixed with fear, mixed with the desperate hope of people who'd been drowning and just found a branch to grab onto. Luke stood, and the room quieted. Then it settled. We start preparing tomorrow. Briggs will work out the route and timeline. I'll handle supplies and logistics. Everyone else, rest up. You're going to need it. The men dispersed slowly, still talking among themselves, voices carrying an energy Clara hadn't heard since she'd arrived. She retreated to the kitchen, suddenly aware of what she'd done. This had been her idea. If it worked, she'd help save them. If it failed, she'd help destroy them faster. The weight of it sat in her stomach like stones. She was scrubbing pots when Luke appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the frame and watched her work. You realize what you started? He said finally. I do. If this goes wrong, I know. Clara set down the pot and turned to face him. But it was going wrong anyway. At least this way there's a chance. Luke moved into the kitchen properly, close enough that she could see the exhaustion written in every line of his body. I should have done this months ago. Should have taken the risk instead of just hoping things would somehow work out. You were scared. That's normal. Scared doesn't save ranches. No, Clara agreed, but neither does giving up, and you didn't give up. That counts for something. He smiled slightly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You're staying for the drive. It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. Figured you'd need someone to cook. We will. But that's not why you're staying. Clara looked away, uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Don't read too much into it. You care about this place, about these people. Luke's voice was quiet. You can pretend you're just passing through all you want, but we both know that stopped being true a while ago. Luke, I'm not asking you for anything, he interrupted, just acknowledging what's already there. You're part of this now, Clara. Whether you admit it or not. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she could walk away tomorrow and never think about Iron Ridge or its people again, but the words wouldn't come because they'd be lies, and they both knew it. When do we leave? She asked instead. Week from tomorrow. Gives us time to prepare, get the herd ready, make sure we've got everything we need. He paused. It's going to be rough, rougher than anything you've probably done before. I've done plenty of rough. Not like this. Clara met his eyes. Then I guess I'll learn. The week that followed was chaos given form and purpose. The ranch that had been dying slowly suddenly blazed with activity. Men everywhere, working from dawn till well past dark, preparing for something that felt impossible but might be their only chance. Briggs took charge of the logistics with the efficiency that surprised Clara. Despite his earlier objections, he threw himself into planning the route, calculating supplies, drilling the younger hands on cattle handling techniques they'd need. His gruffness took on a different quality, still harsh, still demanding, but now with purpose behind it. Luke handled the business end, negotiating with suppliers in town for provisions they couldn't afford but desperately needed, sending telegrams to markets along the route to gauge prices and interest, somehow scraping together enough credit to buy the bare essentials. Clara watched him work and realized how much steel was hidden under that worn-down exterior. He might be scared, but he wasn't weak. And Clara cooked. 3 massive meals a day for men burning calories like furnaces, plus preparing supplies for the trail. Hardtack, dried beans, salt pork, anything that would keep without refrigeration. Her kitchen became a factory, producing food in quantities she'd never attempted before. Tommy helped when he could, learning fast and asking questions that showed he was actually thinking about what he was doing. The kid had potential, Clara thought. If they survived this, he might actually become something. 3 days before departure, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Middle-aged, well-dressed, riding a horse too fine for ordinary travel. Clara saw him from the kitchen window and felt her stomach drop even before Luke came to find her. Man from the bank, Luke said quietly. His face was pale. Wants to talk. They gathered in Luke's office, a small room off the front hall that Clara had never been in before. The banker, whose name was Whitmore, settled into a chair with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards and knew it. Mr. Mercer, Whitmore said pleasantly, I thought I'd check in, see how preparations for the payment are coming along. We're managing, Luke said carefully. Are you? Whitmore opened a leather satchel and pulled out papers. Because from what I understand, you're about to embark on a rather risky cattle drive. Using resources, you don't have to attempt something that hasn't been profitable in years. He smiled without warmth. Forgive me for being skeptical. We'll make the payment. Will you? Because I've been doing this a long time, Mr. Mercer. I've seen plenty of desperate men make desperate plays. Usually doesn't end well. Briggs, who'd been standing by the window, spoke up. We know what we're doing. Do you? From where I sit, you're gambling your last assets on a long shot. And when it doesn't pay off, and it won't, you'll have nothing left. The bank will foreclose, of course, but there won't be anything worth taking. So why are you here? Clara asked. The words came out before she could stop them. Whitmore turned his cold eyes on her. And you are? The cook. The cook? He made it sound like an insult. Well, cook, I'm here to offer Mr. Mercer a way out. A solution that doesn't involve risking everything on a fool's errand. What kind of solution? Luke's voice was flat. Whitmore pulled out another document. Voluntary foreclosure. You sign over the property now, the bank forgives the debt, and everyone walks away clean. You could be in Denver with a fresh start by month's end. The silence in the room was absolute. That's not a solution, Luke said finally. That's surrender. That's reality. This ranch is finished, Mr. Mercer. Has been for a while. I'm offering you a chance to end it with some dignity instead of dragging it out until you've got nothing left but shame and empty pockets. The ranch isn't finished till I say it is. Whitmore sighed like he was dealing with a particularly stubborn child. You're your father's son. I'll give you that. Same pride, same refusal to see reason. It's almost admirable. He stood, tucking the papers away. But pride doesn't pay debts. When this drive of yours fails, and it will, don't say I didn't try to help. He left without waiting for a response, his expensive boots loud on the wooden floor. After he was gone, the three of them sat in heavy silence. Bastard, Briggs muttered. He's not wrong, though, Luke said quietly. This is a long shot, maybe the longest I've ever taken. You want to back out? Clara asked. Luke looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been fear, or might have been determination, or might have been both. No. But I want everyone to know what we're really risking. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about everything, the land, our futures, all of it. And if we fail... He didn't need to finish. They all knew what failure meant. Then we don't fail, Clara said simply. Briggs laughed, sharp and bitter. Just like that? Don't fail? Just like that. She stood, suddenly furious with both of them for their doubt. You want to sit here and list all the ways this could go wrong? Fine. We could lose the herd, could get hit by storms or rustlers or disease, could make it all the way to market and find out the price has dropped and we're still short, could die out there in any number of horrible ways. She moved to the door, then turned back. Or we could make it, could get lucky, could work hard enough to overcome the unlucky parts, could actually pull this off and save this place. But we'll never know if we spend all our time convincing ourselves it's impossible. With that, she walked out, leaving them to their doubt. She had bread to bake and men to feed and no time for second guessing. The night before departure, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her, creaking and groaning like an old ship at sea. Tomorrow they'd leave this place, ride out with 1,000 head of cattle, and hope that was enough to save them all. It was insane. Reckless. Exactly the kind of thing she'd spent her whole life avoiding, and she couldn't wait. Somewhere in the past weeks, without meaning to, she'd stopped being a drifter passing through and become part of something bigger. These men, this ranch, this impossible fight against odds that didn't care about fairness or effort or how hard you tried. It had gotten under her skin, and tomorrow she'd find out if that was the best decision she'd ever made or the worst. She finally drifted off sometime near dawn, and when she woke, the sun was already up and there were sounds of activity from the yard. No time for doubt now. No time for anything but action. Clara dressed quickly and headed downstairs. The kitchen was full of organized chaos, last-minute preparations, final checks of supplies, men moving with purpose and barely controlled nerves. She started coffee, began pulling together breakfast, fell into familiar rhythms that helped quiet the anxiety singing through her veins. They ate quickly, efficiently, no one talking much. The weight of what they were about to attempt sat heavy on everyone. Then Luke stood, and the room went quiet. "We leave in an hour," he said. "Check your gear, check your horses, check everything twice. Once we're on the trail, there's no coming back for things we forgot." He paused, looking around the table at faces Clara had come to know well over the past weeks. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be hard. Harder than any of you expect. But I believe we can do it. Have to believe it, or there's no point in trying." "We'll make it," Tommy said with the confidence of youth. Luke smiled slightly. "Yeah, we will." An hour later, Clara sat on a horse that Luke swore was gentle, watching as the men moved the herd out of the holding pens and onto the trail that would take them God knew where. The cattle were a sea of brown and white, their bellowing loud enough to drown out thought. The horses danced nervously, feeling the energy. Everything felt charged, electric, like lightning about to strike. Briggs rode up beside her. For a moment he just sat there staring at the herd. "You know how to ride?" he asked finally. "Well enough." "Well enough better become damn good over the next few weeks." He looked at her directly. "You started this, Clara. Made it happen when smarter people would have kept their mouths shut. So don't you dare quit on us now." "Wasn't planning on it." "Good." He wheeled his horse around and rode toward the front of the herd, shouting orders that were barely audible over the noise. Clara took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the reins, and nudged her horse forward. The ranch fell away behind them, that dying place that had somehow become home without her permission. Ahead was nothing but open prairie and uncertainty, and the desperate hope that this gamble might actually pay off. They rode into the morning sun, and Clara didn't look back. The first 3 days on the trail were a study in controlled chaos. The cattle moved in a reluctant river of beef and stubbornness, balking at every creek crossing and scattering at shadows that didn't exist. The men rode circuit around them, exhausted and dust-covered, learning the hard way that driving cattle looked a hell of a lot easier than it actually was. Clara learned too. Her gentle horse turned out to have opinions about everything: where to walk, when to stop, which direction to turn. She fought it constantly those first miles, her thighs screaming from muscles she'd never used before. Her hands blistered from reins she gripped too tight. By the second night, she could barely dismount without help, and by the third morning, she seriously considered whether dying might be easier than getting back in that saddle. But she did it anyway. Climbed up despite the pain, settled in despite wanting to scream, and kept moving because stopping wasn't an option. The cooking was worse than she'd expected. Try making biscuits over an open fire when the wind kept changing direction and you had limited supplies and 7 hungry men watching your every move. Clara burned the first batch, undercooked the second, and finally got it right on the third attempt when she was too tired to care anymore. "Not bad," Rayford said, chewing thoughtfully. "Little dense, but not bad." Clara was too exhausted to take offense. She just nodded and started cleaning up, her hands moving on autopilot while her brain shut down to conserve energy. Luke found her after dinner, sitting by the fire and staring at nothing. "How you holding up?" he asked. "Ask me when I can feel my legs again." He smiled slightly. "Gets easier, eventually." "When?" "Couple weeks," Clara groaned. "I'll be dead by then." "Nah, you're tougher than you think." Luke settled down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You did good today. Kept up, didn't complain, fed everyone despite the conditions. That matters." "Feels like I'm barely surviving." "That's all any of us are doing." He stared into the fire, his face highlighted in orange and shadow. "Survival counts for more than you'd think." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the herd settling for the night. In the distance, someone was singing, a low, mournful tune that suited the prairie darkness. "Luke," Clara said quietly, "what happens if we get there and it's not enough? If we sell everything and we're still short?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful, measured. "Then we tried. At least we can say that." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Clara looked at him, really looked at him in the firelight. He was holding himself together through sheer will, she realized. Projecting confidence he didn't feel, leading men who were counting on him to somehow make this work. And underneath it all was the same fear she felt, the same doubt. "We're going to make it," she said, trying to sound certain. Luke glanced at her, something soft in his expression. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point?" "Yeah." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow's another long day." She watched him walk away, his silhouette disappearing into darkness beyond the firelight. Then she spread her bedroll near the supply wagon and tried to find a position that didn't make everything hurt. Sleep came hard but deep, and when Briggs kicked her awake before dawn, she felt like she'd been unconscious for maybe 10 minutes. "Up," he said shortly. "Coffee won't make itself." Clara wanted to tell him where he could shove his coffee, but her mouth was too dry to form words. She dragged herself upright and stumbled to the fire, where coals from last night still glowed faintly. Building it back up was automatic now. Add kindling, blow gently, watch it catch. Soon she had flames and could start the coffee that would make everyone else functional. The routine became familiar faster than she'd expected. Wake before dawn, make coffee, cook breakfast while the men broke camp, ride all day with breaks for the herd to graze and water, make dinner, clean up, collapse, repeat. By the end of the first week, Clara could mount her horse without wincing. By the second week, she could actually enjoy moments of the ride, the way the prairie stretched endless in all directions, the sound of meadowlarks in the grass, the satisfaction of a meal well cooked despite impossible conditions. And the men changed too. The work was brutal, the hours long, but something was shifting in them. They moved with more purpose, talked with more energy. Even the complaints had a different quality. Less resignation, more the kind of griping that came from people who were actually invested in what they were doing. Tommy especially seemed to thrive. He was everywhere at once, helping with the herd, assisting Clara with cooking, learning from the older hands with an enthusiasm that was almost infectious. One night he rode up beside her, grinning despite the dust coating his face. "Miss Clara, did you see that? I turned back 6 head that were trying to break off. Didn't lose a single one." "I saw," Clara said. "Good work." "Briggs said I'm getting the hang of it." Actual praise from Briggs. Can you believe it? Clara could believe it. She'd noticed Briggs watching the kid with something that might have been approval, though he'd never say it outright. The foreman was hard but not cruel, demanding but fair. She was starting to understand why Luke had kept him on despite their differences. The weather held for 2 weeks. Then, on the 15th day, the sky to the west went dark. Clara noticed it first. She'd gotten in the habit of checking the horizon while she cooked, watching for changes that might mean trouble. This change was unmistakable. Clouds building like mountains, that particular greenish tint that meant serious weather. "Luke," she called out, "you need to see this." He came over, took one look, and his face went pale. "Briggs," his voice carried across the camp. "Storm coming, big one." The camp exploded into activity. Men scrambling to secure supplies, check the herd, prepare for whatever was coming. Briggs rode through giving orders in that sharp, commanding voice that cut through panic. "Get the cattle to that low ground near the creek. Give them somewhere to shelter. Move." Clara helped tie down everything that could blow away, working fast despite her racing heart. She'd been through storms before, but not like this. Not out in the open with nothing between her and the sky but canvas and hope. The wind hit first. It came in a rush that nearly knocked her over, tearing at her clothes and filling the air with dust. Then the temperature dropped, a sudden cold that raised goosebumps on her arms. "Get to the wagon." Luke grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the supply wagon where they'd stretched a tarp for shelter. "Now!" They made it just as the rain started. Not gentle rain, this was water falling in sheets, driven sideways by wind that howled like something alive. Lightning split the sky, so close Clara could smell the ozone. Thunder followed immediately, loud enough to feel in her chest. The cattle were bellowing, panic in their voices. Clara could hear men shouting, trying to keep the herd together, but the wind tore their words away before they could carry. "They're going to bolt," Luke said, his voice tight with fear. "If they stampede in this—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Clara knew enough to understand what a stampede meant. Trampled men, lost cattle, their whole endeavor destroyed in minutes of blind terror. Then someone was screaming. A voice she recognized. Tommy. Luke was moving before Clara could process it, running out into the storm toward the sound. She followed without thinking, rain immediately soaking her to the skin, wind threatening to tear her off her feet. The scene that greeted her was chaos. The herd was breaking, cattle scattering in all directions, their eyes white with fear. And in the middle of it, Tommy's horse was down, the kid trapped underneath, leg bent at an angle that made Clara's stomach turn. "Help me!" Tommy's voice was high with pain and terror. "Please!" Men were trying to reach him, but the cattle were everywhere, a moving wall of muscle and horn that could crush a man without noticing. Luke didn't hesitate. He rode straight into the mess, somehow finding gaps that didn't seem to exist, dodging hooves and horns with reflexes Clara didn't know he had. He reached Tommy just as a massive bull swung its head toward the downed horse. Luke put himself between them, his own horse dancing nervously, and somehow, Clara would never understand how, convinced the bull to veer away. "Rayford, Pete, get over here!" Luke was shouting over the storm. "We need to move this horse!" They converged on Tommy's position, 3 men working together to lift the horse enough that Tommy could drag himself free. The kid screamed when they moved him, a sound that cut through even the storm's roar. Clara ran to help, skidding in mud that had formed in seconds. She got her arms under Tommy's shoulders and helped pull him clear just as the horse struggled upright and bolted. "His leg's broken," she said unnecessarily. The bone was definitely fractured, possibly worse. "Get him to the wagon," Luke ordered. "Clara, you're with him. Everyone else, back to the herd. We're losing them." Getting Tommy to the wagon was a nightmare of mud and wind and the kids' agonized breathing. Clara and Rayford carried him between them, trying to be gentle while moving fast enough to matter. By the time they got him under cover, Clara's arms were shaking and Tommy had passed out from pain. "Stay with him," Rayford said, already turning back to the storm. "Keep pressure on that leg if it starts bleeding worse." Then Clara was alone with an unconscious 19-year-old in a storm that showed no signs of stopping. She found relatively dry blankets and wrapped Tommy carefully, then braced his leg as best she could with supplies meant for cooking, not doctoring. The storm raged for hours. Clara lost track of time, focused entirely on keeping Tommy warm and still, checking his breathing, trying not to think about what was happening outside. She could hear shouting occasionally, the thunder of hooves, once what might have been someone screaming. When the rain finally stopped and the wind died to something less than lethal, Clara carefully extracted herself from the wagon and stepped out into devastation. The camp was destroyed, supplies scattered across 100 yards, the fire drowned, equipment broken or missing. And the herd, she could see cattle in the distance, but nowhere near the 1,000 they'd started with. Luke appeared out of the gray dawn light, soaked and muddy and bleeding from a gash on his forehead he didn't seem to notice. "Tommy?" he asked. "Alive. Unconscious. Legs definitely broken, maybe other injuries I can't see." Luke closed his eyes briefly. "Anyone else hurt?" "Don't know. Haven't seen the others." They started appearing then, one by one. Rayford with a black eye and split lip, Pete limping, others bruised and battered but moving. Last came Briggs, riding a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. "Lost about 200 head, he said without preamble. "Scattered to hell and gone. Might find some of them, but most are probably in the next county by now." The number hit like a physical blow. 200 head, a fifth of their herd just gone. Clara did the math automatically. They'd been counting on selling at least 900 to make the payment. Now they had 800, maybe less if more had injuries or died from the stress. "We can still make it," she heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. "Can we?" Briggs's voice was flat. "Because I'm not seeing how. We needed every head we had, and now we're 200 short. Even if we get top dollar for what's left, we won't make the payment." "So we find another way," Clara said. "There is no other way," Briggs was shouting now, exhaustion and frustration boiling over. "We took the risk. We lost. It's over. Best thing we can do now is sell what we've got, pay the men for their time, and head home before we lose anything else." "Home to what?" Luke's voice was quiet, but it cut through Briggs's anger. "Home to the bank taking everything anyway? At least out here we tried. Trying doesn't pay debts. Neither does giving up." They faced off, 2 men at the end of their rope, both right and both wrong. Clara watched and felt something snap inside her, some last restraint that had been holding her back from fully committing to this impossible mess. "Luke," she said, "how far to the next town?" He blinked at the change of subject. "Maybe 20 miles. "Why?" "Because I'm going to ride ahead, find out what the market prices are really looking like, see if there are buyers we haven't considered." She was making this up as she went, running on adrenaline and desperation. Maybe there's a way to make up the difference. Different markets, different timing, something. "That's insane," Briggs said. "You don't know anything about cattle markets." "Then I'll learn." Clara turned to Luke. "Give me a horse in a day. If I can't find something useful, we'll do it your way. Sell and go home. But let me try." Luke studied her for a long moment. She could see him weighing options, calculating risks, trying to decide if this was desperation or determination. "All right," he said finally. "Take the roan, she's steady. But Clara, don't do anything stupid. Wouldn't dream of it." An hour later, Clara was riding toward a town she'd never seen, carrying hopes she had no right to bear. The roan was indeed steady, which was good because Clara's horsemanship was barely adequate for normal riding, much less whatever she was about to attempt. The town, when she reached it, was bigger than expected. Not quite a city, but more than a dusty crossroads, actual streets, multiple buildings, signs of commerce and life. Clara rode straight to what looked like the main thoroughfare and started asking questions. The first person she talked to was a merchant who laughed when she mentioned cattle prices. "You're about a week late," he said. "Big buyer came through, bought up everything. Prices are in the dirt now till he moves his stock." When's he moving it? Month, maybe. Who knows? Clara thanked him and moved on, asking everyone she could find, other merchants, ranchers bringing in goods, even the bartender at the saloon who seemed to know everyone's business. The picture that emerged wasn't encouraging. The market was flooded, prices were low, and there were no major buyers in the area looking for cattle. She was about ready to give up when she overheard a conversation at the general store. Telling you, Henderson's desperate. Lost half his herd to disease, needs replacements fast for his government contract. Henderson won't pay fair prices. He'll lowball everyone. Maybe, but he's got money, and he needs cattle now. That's more than most can say. Clara's ears perked up. She casually moved closer to the two men talking, pretending to examine sacks of flour. "Where's Henderson based?" she asked casually. One of the men looked her over skeptically. "North of here, big operation, supplies beef to the army posts." "Why?" "Just curious." But her mind was racing. A government contractor who needed cattle immediately and had money to spend. That was exactly what they needed. Someone who'd pay premium prices because he didn't have a choice. She spent another hour gathering information about Henderson, where to find him, what his operation looked like, whether he was actually trustworthy or just talk. Then she rode back to camp faster than was probably smart, her mind spinning with possibilities. Luke met her at the edge of camp. One look at her face and his expression shifted from tired to alert. "You found something," he said. "Maybe. There's a big contractor north of here, supplies beef to the army. He needs cattle fast and he's got money. If we can get to him before other sellers do, we might be able to negotiate better prices." "How far north?" 4 days? Maybe 5? "That's the wrong direction. Market south." "The market south is flooded and prices are terrible." "This is our best shot, Luke." Briggs had appeared during this exchange. "You're suggesting we add a week to our timeline and head into territory we don't know. Chasing a maybe? That's your plan?" "You got a better one?" Clara shot back. "Yeah. Sell what we've got, take our losses, go home with something instead of nothing. That's not better. That's just safer." "Sometimes safe is better." Luke held up a hand before the argument could escalate. "Let me think." He walked away, leaving Clara and Briggs staring at each other across ground neither was willing to cede. The foreman's face was unreadable, but Clara could feel his disapproval radiating like heat. "You're going to get people killed," Briggs said quietly. "You know that, right? Push too hard, take too many risks, and someone's going to pay the price." Maybe Tommy was just the start. The words hit hard because they might be true. Clara had been pushing since she'd arrived, pushing Luke to try the drive, pushing the men to work harder, and now pushing for this last desperate gamble. And Tommy was lying in the wagon with a broken leg because she'd convinced them all this was worth attempting. "Then tell me what to do instead," Clara said, her voice tight. "Tell me how to save this place without taking risks. I'm listening." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. "You can't save everything, Clara. Sometimes the best you can do is walk away with enough to start over. That's not failure, that's survival." "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, giving up now means everyone loses everything. At least my way, there's a chance. A chance to lose even more. Or a chance to actually win." Luke returned before Briggs could respond. His face was set, determined. "We're going north," he said. Briggs closed his eyes. "Luke, I know. It's risky, it's desperate, it might fail. But Clara's right. Doing it safe means definitely failing. At least this way we've got a shot." He looked at both of them. "We tell the men, give them a choice. Anyone wants to head back, no hard feelings, but I'm seeing this through." The men, when given the choice, elected to continue. Even the ones who looked doubtful, who had to be exhausted and scared and wondering what they'd gotten themselves into, they all agreed to keep going. Except Tommy. Tommy couldn't continue anything with a broken leg. They left him in town with enough money for a doctor and a room at the boarding house, with promises to come back for him when this was over. "You better make it," Tommy said from his bed, pale but smiling. "I want my share of the pay." "We'll make it," Clara promised, hoping it was true. The ride north was harder than anything before. They were tired, short-handed, pushing cattle that were already stressed from the storm. Tempers frayed. Small arguments became big ones. Even the weather seemed hostile. hot during the day and cold at night, with no comfortable middle ground. On the third day, disaster struck again. They were crossing a ravine, moving the herd carefully down one side and up the other, when Luke's horse stumbled. Clara saw it happen from her position at the rear, the horse's leg buckling, Luke pitching forward, and then the sickening sound of impact as he hit the ground and the horse rolled on top of him. Men were shouting, rushing to help. Clara kicked her horse forward, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. By the time she reached them, they'd gotten the horse off Luke, but he wasn't moving. "Luke!" She was off her horse and on her knees beside him before she'd consciously decided to move. "Luke, can you hear me?" He groaned, which was something. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused. "What happened?" "Your horse fell. Don't move. You might be injured." But he was already trying to sit up, wincing with pain. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute." He wasn't fine. Claire could see bruising already forming on his ribs, and the way he held his left arm suggested it was hurt. But he was conscious and moving, which was better than the alternative. Briggs appeared, his face grim. "How bad?" "Ribs may be cracked, arm might be sprained. Could be worse." Luke managed to get upright with help, swaying slightly. "Could be better too." "You need to rest. We need to keep moving. Henderson won't wait forever." "Luke, I'll rest when we get there. Right now, we move." They moved. What choice did they have? Luke rode despite obvious pain, directing the operation from horseback when he should have been lying down. Clara watched him with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The man was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and she couldn't decide which. That night, after the herd was settled and the men were eating, Clara found Luke sitting apart from the others, holding his ribs and trying not to show it. "You're an idiot," she said, sitting down beside him. "Probably." "Definitely." She pulled out a strip of cloth she'd been carrying. "Let me wrap those ribs. Won't fix them, but it'll help." He didn't argue, which told her how much pain he was actually in. Clara worked carefully, wrapping the cloth tight around his torso while trying not to cause more damage. This close, she could feel the heat radiating off him, see the exhaustion written in every line of his face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, "pushing yourself past breaking when you should be recovering." "Because if I stop, everything stops. The men need to see that we're not giving up, that we can keep going even when things get bad." He looked at her directly. "Same reason you're still here instead of back in that town with Tommy." "I'm here because I'm stubborn." "Yeah, me too." He smiled slightly. "We're a good match that way." The words hung between them, meaning more than what was said. Clara finished wrapping his ribs and sat back, suddenly aware of how close they were, how the firelight made shadows dance across his face, how easy it would be to lean in just a little bit more. She stood up instead. "Get some sleep. You need it." Clara, "Sleep, Luke, that's an order." She walked away before he could say whatever he'd been about to say, before she could do something stupid like admit that she cared about him more than was smart, that the thought of him getting hurt made her chest tight with fear she couldn't name. Henderson's ranch appeared on the horizon 2 days later, a sprawling operation that made Iron Ridge look tiny by comparison. Clara's stomach knotted with nervousness as they approached. This was it, their last chance to make this work. A man rode out to meet them, tall, weathered, with the confident bearing of someone who owned more than he could see. "You Henderson?" Luke asked. "I am. And you are?" "Luke Mercer. Heard you might be looking for cattle." Henderson's eyes swept over their herd, assessing. "Might be. What are you selling?" 800 head. Good stock, well maintained." "That's so." Henderson rode closer, examining the cattle with an expert eye. Clara held her breath, watching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. Finally, Henderson turned back to them. "They're thin, stressed from travel. I'll give you $8 a head." $8. Clara did the math quickly. That was $6,400, more than enough for the payment with money left over. Relief flooded through her so fast she felt dizzy. But Luke was shaking his head. "Market rate's 12. Market rate for healthy cattle. These need fattening up, recovery time. 8's fair." 10. Henderson considered. 9. Final offer. Clara wanted to scream at Luke to take it. $9 a head was $7,200, more than they needed, more than they'd hoped for. but Luke's face was set, determined. "These cattle are worth more than 9, he said. "You need them fast, which means you'll pay premium. 11 ahead, and we've got a deal." The silence stretched. Henderson stared at Luke, Luke stared back, and Clara stopped breathing entirely. Finally, Henderson smiled. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. 10.50. But that's truly final." Luke glanced at Briggs, who gave the smallest of nods. Then he extended his hand. "Deal." They shook on it, and just like that, it was over. $8,400. More than enough to pay the bank and keep Iron Ridge running. They'd done it. The celebration that night was subdued, everyone too exhausted to do more than smile and shake hands and mumble congratulations. Clara cooked a better dinner than usual, the last of their good supplies, made with care now that the pressure was finally off. Luke found her after, sitting by the fire and staring at nothing. "We did it," he said, settling beside her. "You did it. I just cooked." "You did a hell of a lot more than cook." He was quiet for a moment. "We wouldn't have made it without you, Clara. The drive, the idea to find Henderson, keeping everyone fed and functional, all of it. You saved us." Clara shook her head. "You saved yourselves. I just helped." "Is that what you're going to tell yourself when you leave?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "We're heading back tomorrow. 2 weeks and we'll be home, debt paid, crisis averted. And then you'll leave, because that's what you do. You'll pack that bag you never unpacked and disappear. And we'll probably never see you again." Clara opened her mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. She'd been planning to leave since the moment she'd arrived, and now that the immediate crisis was over, there was no reason to stay. Except there was. Somewhere along the way, Iron Ridge had stopped being a place she was temporarily stuck and become somewhere she actually wanted to be. These people had stopped being strangers and become something closer to family. And Luke had stopped being just another boss and become someone who made her think about futures and permanence and all the things she'd told herself she didn't want. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Luke nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just think about it, okay? Before you make any decisions you can't take back." He stood and walked away, leaving Clara alone with thoughts that refused to settle and a heart that didn't know what it wanted. The ride home was easier, faster, unburdened by the pressure of failure hanging over them. They picked up Tommy in town, pale but healing, and he rode in the supply wagon telling exaggerated stories about his injury that made everyone laugh. And then they were home. Iron Ridge appeared on the horizon exactly as they'd left it, worn down and tired, but still standing. Clara felt something loosen in her chest at the sight of it, something that might have been relief, or might have been recognition. This place had gotten under her skin. These people had gotten into her heart. And walking away from them was going to hurt in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. But first, they had a bank to deal with. The money sat on Luke's desk in neat stacks, $8,400 in bills that represented every mile they'd ridden, every hour they'd worked, every risk they'd taken. Clara stood in the doorway watching Luke count it for the third time, his hands shaking slightly as he verified what they already knew. They'd done it. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, they'd actually pulled it off. "I keep thinking I'm going to count wrong," Luke said without looking up, "that somehow the numbers will change and we'll be short again." "They won't," Clara said. "It's real, Luke. We made it." He finally looked at her, and the expression on his face was something between disbelief and exhaustion. "We should go to the bank tomorrow, get this over with. You should rest tonight, celebrate a little. The bank's not going anywhere." "Neither is the debt." But he stood, stretching carefully around his still healing ribs. "You're right, though. Tomorrow's soon enough." That night's dinner was the closest thing to a party Iron Ridge had probably seen in years. The men knew they'd succeeded, knew the ranch was saved, and the relief made them almost giddy. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that had been hidden somewhere, and even Briggs cracked what might have been a smile. Clara cooked everything she could think of, used up supplies they'd been hoarding, made dishes she hadn't attempted since arriving. The dining room filled with laughter and stories, each man taking turns embellishing their role in the drive until the whole thing sounded like an adventure from a dime novel instead of the grueling slog it had actually been. And then Clara rides into town like some kind of avenging angel, Rayford was saying, gesturing with his whiskey glass. Comes back with this wild idea about Henderson, and damned if it didn't work. Wasn't that wild? Clara protested. Just information. Information that saved our asses, Tommy added. His leg was propped up on a chair, still healing but looking better every day. You're a miracle worker, Miss Clara. I'm a cook who got lucky. You're more than that, Luke said quietly. The room went silent, everyone turning to look at him. You showed up here with nothing, didn't owe us anything, and ended up risking everything to help save this place. That's not luck. That's character. Clara felt heat rising in her cheeks. I just did what needed doing. Exactly. Luke raised his glass. To Clara Hale, who did what needed doing even when it wasn't her fight. We owe you more than we can repay. To Clara, the men chorused, raising their own glasses. She wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to do anything but sit there being toasted like some kind of hero. But the genuine gratitude in their faces stopped her. These men had become her people without her permission, and their appreciation mattered more than she wanted to admit. To Iron Ridge, she said finally, raising her own glass. And to all of us making it back in one piece, more or less. They drank to that, and the party continued into the night. Clara eventually retreated to the kitchen, needing space from the intensity of their gratitude. She was washing dishes when Briggs appeared in the doorway. You planning to run? He asked without preamble. Clara's hand stilled in the water. What? Simple question. We get through this, pay the bank, everything settles down, you planning to disappear? I don't know, Clara said honestly. Briggs moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. Up close, he looked older than she'd thought, worn down by years of hard decisions and harder consequences. You should know something. I fought Luke on keeping you here. Thought you were a distraction, thought you'd cause more problems than you'd solve. I know. I was wrong. He said it simply, without drama. You changed this place, changed these men. Hell, even changed me a little, though I'd deny it if you told anyone. He paused. Point is, if you leave now, you're going to break something that just started healing, and I'm asking you, begging you, if that's what it takes, to think hard before you do that. Clara turned to look at him fully. You want me to stay. I want you to do what's right. If that's staying, good. If it's leaving, then at least give us warning so we can prepare. His voice softened slightly. But yeah, for what it's worth, I think you should stay. Think this place needs you. Think Luke needs you, though he'd probably choke before admitting it. Briggs, just think about it. He pushed off from the counter. That's all I'm asking. He left before she could respond, leaving Clara alone with dishes and decisions she wasn't ready to make. The next morning, Luke and Clara rode into town together. The money was in Luke's saddlebag, a weight they both felt even though it wasn't that heavy. Neither of them talked much during the ride. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't make this moment bigger than it already was. The bank was a solid brick building on Main Street, imposing and permanent in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. Clara tied her horse and followed Luke inside, her stomach tight with nervousness she couldn't quite name. Whitmore was waiting in his office, looking pleased in a way that made Clara's skin crawl. He probably thought they'd failed, that he'd be foreclosing today instead of accepting payment. Mr. Mercer, Whitmore said, not bothering to hide his smirk. I wasn't expecting to see you. Thought perhaps you'd reconsidered my offer. We made the payment, Luke said flatly. He pulled out the money and started counting it onto Whitmore's desk. $1,200. As agreed. Whitmore's smirk faded. He watched the bills pile up, his expression shifting from smug to confused to something that might have been anger. This is unexpected, he said when Luke finished counting. But acceptable, right? Clara asked. The debt's paid. That means the foreclosure is canceled. Whitmore's eyes flicked to her, cold and assessing. The debt is paid. However, there are other considerations. Additional fees, processing costs. What fees? Luke's voice had gone dangerous. The agreement was $1,200. That's what we just gave you. Yes, but given the irregular circumstances, the bank has determined that additional security measures are warranted. Insurance against future defaults, if you will. Whitmore pulled out papers, sliding them across the desk. An additional $300 would settle these concerns. Clara felt fury rising in her chest. That's not legal. You can't just add fees after the fact. I assure you it's completely within the bank's rights. Show me. Clara leaned forward, her voice sharp. Show me in the original agreement where it says you can add arbitrary fees whenever you feel like it. Whitmore's jaw tightened. The bank's lawyers have reviewed. I don't care what your lawyers reviewed. Show me the contract. For a long moment, Whitmore just stared at her. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick document, sliding it across the desk. Page 12, Section 4. Clara grabbed it and started reading. The language was dense, full of legal terminology designed to confuse, but she pushed through it. Luke read over her shoulder, both of them searching for the clause Whitmore referenced. This says the bank can charge reasonable fees for default proceedings, Clara said finally. But we didn't default. We made the payment on time. The drive constituted a material change in operational structure. That's insane, Luke interrupted. We sold cattle. That's what ranches do. You can't penalize us for running our business. The bank can and will protect its interests. Clara read further, her eyes catching on something in Section 7. She read it twice to make sure she understood, then looked up at Whitmore with something close to triumph. This clause here, it says any disputes about fees must be resolved by independent arbitration before they can be enforced, which means you can't hold our payment hostage while you make up fake charges. She leaned back. We're paid in full, Whitmore. Legal and binding. Try to add fees if you want, but we'll fight you every step, and given that your clause about operational changes is flimsy at best, I like our chances. Whitmore's face had gone red. You're making a mistake. No, Luke said quietly. You're making a mistake. Testing us when we just proved we can deliver. Trying to squeeze more out of people who've got nothing left to give. That's not banking. That's just cruelty. He stood, and Clara stood with him. Our business is done here, Luke said. Unless you want to file those arbitration papers and spend the next 6 months in court over $300 you're not legally entitled to. Whitmore was silent, his jaw working. Finally, he pulled the money toward him and started writing out a receipt with angry, jerky movements. Paid in full, he said, shoving the paper across the desk. The property is yours. For now. For now is all anyone gets, Clara said. She took the receipt and folded it carefully, tucking it into her pocket like the precious thing it was. Come on, Luke. We're done here. They walked out of the bank into sunshine that felt brighter than before. Luke stopped on the steps, just breathing, his whole body sagging with relief so profound it was almost visible. We did it, he said. Really did it. Yeah. Clara felt something loosening in her own chest, tension she'd been carrying for weeks finally releasing. We really did. Luke turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. That thing you did in there, reading the contract, finding the loophole, standing up to Whitmore when he tried to cheat us. That was incredible. Just used common sense. No, you fought for us, for this ranch, these people, like it mattered to you. He moved closer. Like we matter to you. Claire wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to do anything but acknowledge what was happening between them. But she was tired of running, tired of pretending she didn't care when she clearly did. You do matter, she said quietly. All of you. This place. It matters more than I wanted it to. Then stay. Luke's voice was rough with emotion. Don't just stay for a week or a month. Actually stay. Help us rebuild this place into something better than it was. You've got ideas, Clara. I've seen them. The Sunday dinners, the way you got the men invested, all of it. We need that. Need you. Luke, I'm not asking for promises. Not asking you to marry me or pledge your life or anything like that. Just asking you to give us a real chance. Give yourself a real chance at something permanent. The word permanent hung between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Clara had spent 10 years running from permanent, convinced it would only end in pain. But standing here, looking at Luke's hopeful, frightened face, she couldn't remember why permanent seemed so dangerous. I don't know how to stay, she admitted. I've spent so long moving that I don't know what staying looks like. Neither do I. But we could figure it out together. Luke took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. What do you say? Want to try? Clara thought about her bag upstairs, still packed after all these weeks. Thought about all the towns she'd left behind, all the people she'd walked away from. Thought about how none of those places had ever felt like home the way Iron Ridge did, how none of those people had ever looked at her the way Luke was looking at her now. Yeah, she heard herself say, I want to try. Luke's smile was like sunrise, bright and transformative. He pulled her into a hug that was careful around his healing ribs, but fierce in its intensity. Clara let herself lean into it, let herself imagine what it might be like to have this every day instead of just in stolen moments. We should get back, Luke said finally, not letting go. Tell the men. Make it official. Make what official? That you're staying, that you're part of Iron Ridge now, not just passing through. He pulled back enough to look at her. Unless you want to keep it quiet. No. Clara was surprised by her own certainty. No, let's tell them. Let's make it real. The ride back to the ranch felt different. Lighter somehow, like a weight Clara hadn't known she was carrying had finally lifted. She'd made a choice. Not the safe choice, not the familiar choice, but the one that felt right in ways she was still processing. The men were working when they arrived, scattered across the yard on various tasks. Luke called them all together, and they gathered with curious expressions, probably wondering if there was more bad news. Debt's paid, Luke announced. Ranch is ours, free and clear. The cheer that went up was loud enough to spook the horses. Men whooped and hollered, slapping each other on the back, relief and joy mixing into something that sounded like celebration. When they quieted down, Luke continued. But we've still got work ahead of us. This place needs rebuilding, equipment, infrastructure, all of it, and I've been thinking about how to do that differently than before. He glanced at Clara, and she gave him a small nod of encouragement. Way I see it, Luke said, we succeeded because we all had skin in the game. Everyone worked harder because everyone cared about the outcome. So I'm proposing we make that permanent. Instead of just hired hands, you'd be partners, profit sharing, decision making, all of it. This wouldn't just be my ranch, it'd be ours, together. Silence. The men exchanged glances, clearly not sure they'd heard right. You're serious? Rayford asked finally. Dead serious. I've got a lawyer drawing up papers. Obviously there'd be details to work out, but the core idea is this. We build Iron Ridge together. We share in its success. Or its failure, if it comes to that. Tommy shook his head in disbelief. That's not how ranches work. Maybe it should be, Clara said. All eyes turned to her. You all proved you're worth more than just wages. Proved you'll fight for this place when it matters. Why shouldn't you benefit when things go well? Because that's not how it's done, Briggs said. But his voice lacked conviction. Bosses and workers, that's the structure, always has been. Doesn't mean it always has to be, Luke countered. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I know that running this place alone nearly killed it. Maybe together we can do better. The men were quiet, processing. Clara could see them weighing it, the security of traditional employment against the risk and reward of partnership. It was a lot to ask, a complete restructuring of how they saw themselves and their work. Finally, Briggs spoke. What percentage are we talking? Luke smiled. Was hoping you'd ask. Thought we'd start with 40% split among the crew, keep 60 for ranch operations and my share. Adjust as we figure out what works. 40%. Briggs did the math visibly. That's actually fair, more than fair. So you're in? Briggs looked around at the other men, reading their faces. Then he extended his hand. Yeah, I'm in. Let's try something different. One by one, the others agreed. Some enthusiastically, some cautiously, but all of them willing to take the chance. Clara watched it happen and felt something shifting in her understanding of what was possible. They were building something new here, something that didn't follow the old rules. It was messy and uncertain, and probably harder than doing things the traditional way, but it was theirs. Over the next weeks, the ranch transformed. Not physically, they didn't have the money for major renovations yet, but in atmosphere, in energy, in the way people moved through the space. Men who'd been going through the motions started taking initiative, suggesting improvements, caring about outcomes in ways that went beyond just keeping their jobs. Tommy. Leg finally healed enough to work light duty, became obsessed with the ranch's finances. He'd sit at the kitchen table with Luke's ledgers, finding inefficiencies and suggesting changes with the enthusiasm of someone who now had a stake in the numbers adding up. Rayford started a garden behind the kitchen, growing vegetables that would cut their food costs and improve their meals. Should have done this years ago, he told Clara while they planted rows of beans. Just never seemed worth the effort when it wasn't my garden. Even Briggs changed. He was still gruff, still demanding, but now he explained his decisions instead of just issuing orders, brought the men into planning conversations, listened to suggestions he would have dismissed before. And Clara? Clara stopped thinking about leaving. She unpacked her bag for the first time in 10 years, put her few possessions in drawers instead of keeping them ready to grab. It felt strange and vulnerable and absolutely right. She also expanded her role beyond just cooking, started keeping proper inventory of supplies, negotiating with merchants in town, even helping Tommy with the financial planning. Turned out a decade of moving from job to job had taught her more about running operations than she'd realized. One evening, about a month after they'd paid off the bank, Luke found her in the kitchen working through supply orders. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her. "Next how?" "Long term, where this all goes, what we build here?" He gestured vaguely at the papers. "You're doing way more than cooking now. Feels like we should make that official somehow." Clara set down her pencil. "What are you suggesting?" "Partnership, real partnership, with papers and percentages and all of it. You've earned it, Clara, more than earned it." "Luke, She stopped, not sure what to say. A month ago she would have refused, would have insisted she was just helping temporarily. But now, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." "Yeah." His face lit up. "Yeah, I'm in this now, might as well make it official." Luke reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you. For everything. For staying, for fighting, for giving us a chance when we didn't deserve it." "You deserved it," Clara said. "You just needed someone to believe it first." They sat like that for a while, hands linked across a table covered in papers that represented their shared future. Outside, the sounds of the ranch settling for the night filtered through, horses in the corral, men calling good nights to each other, the comfortable sounds of a place that was alive again. The seasons changed. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter. The ranch survived its first year under the new structure, then its second. They didn't get rich, but they got stable. The herd grew. Equipment got repaired and replaced. The house stopped looking like it was one strong wind from collapsing. And the people changed too. Tommy grew into his role as the ranch's unofficial accountant, his natural head for numbers turning into real skill. Rayford's garden expanded into something that actually contributed meaningfully to their food supply. New hands were hired under the partnership model, bringing fresh energy and ideas. Briggs started teaching the younger men everything he knew, passing down skills that would have died with him otherwise. He'd grumble about it, claim he was too old to be playing teacher, but Clara saw the satisfaction in his face when one of his students mastered a technique. And Luke? Luke became the leader he'd always had the potential to be. Less burdened, more confident, willing to delegate and trust instead of carrying everything alone. He and Clara ran the ranch together, their different skills complementing each other in ways that made the whole operation stronger. They never talked about what they were to each other, exactly. Didn't need to. It was obvious in the way he looked at her, the way she found excuses to touch his arm in passing, the way they moved around each other like two parts of a whole that had finally found its match. One spring evening, 2 years after Clara had first arrived at Iron Ridge, she stood on the porch watching the sun set over land that had become home. The ranch was thriving now, not just surviving, but actually thriving. They'd paid off not just the original debt, but additional loans they'd taken for improvements. The herd was healthy, the men were happy, everything they'd fought for had actually worked. Luke joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed her one and stood close enough that their shoulders touched. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying, I mean, giving up the wandering life." Clara thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I wonder where I'd be if I'd kept moving, what towns I'd have seen, what jobs I'd have worked." She paused. "But no, I don't regret it. This is better than anything I would have found out there. Even with all the hard parts, the work, the risk, all of it. Especially because of the hard parts." "What?" Clara turned to look at him. "I spent 10 years looking for easy. Never found it because easy doesn't exist. But I found this. Something worth fighting for. That's better than easy." Luke smiled. that soft expression that still made her heart do complicated things. You changed everything, you know that? Showed up here with nothing but grit and a gift for cooking, and somehow saved us all. I didn't save anyone, we saved ourselves. We saved each other, Luke corrected. That's the point. None of us could have done it alone, but together we managed the impossible. Clara leaned into him, letting herself enjoy the simple comfort of his presence. He was right. Together they'd managed the impossible, turned a dying ranch into a thriving one, converted desperate men into invested partners, built something new out of the ruins of what had been. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. They still had hard days, still had setbacks and challenges and moments when it felt like everything might fall apart again. But they faced those moments together now, not alone. And that made all the difference. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked. "That I'm glad my horse went lame outside Stillwell. Glad I got caught in that dust storm. Glad some stubborn rancher was too decent to let a stranger die." Clara smiled. "Glad I'm not the settling down type, except apparently I am when it's the right place." "And this is the right place?" "Yeah." Clara said it with certainty she'd never felt about anywhere else. This is exactly the right place. They stood together as the sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch stretched out before them, not the dying remnant Clara had first seen, but something vital and alive. The men were gathering for dinner, drawn by the smell of Clara's cooking and the promise of community. Inside, there would be food and laughter and the comfortable chaos of people who'd become family. There would be plans for tomorrow, for next week, for next year. There would be challenges and triumphs and ordinary moments that somehow added up to a life worth living. Clara had spent 10 years running from exactly this, from permanence, from belonging, from the risk of caring too much and losing it all. She'd been so sure that staying meant vulnerability, meant setting herself up for pain. Turned out staying meant something else entirely. It meant waking up every day and choosing to fight for something bigger than yourself. It meant letting people see you, really see you, flaws and fears and all the messy parts you usually kept hidden. It meant trusting that you deserved good things, and that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, good things actually lasted. The kitchen bell rang, calling everyone to dinner. Luke squeezed her hand once and headed inside. Clara followed, pausing at the door to look back one more time at the land she'd helped save. Iron Ridge wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was proof that broken things could be repaired, that desperate people could find hope, that a woman with nothing but grit and determination could build something that mattered. It was home. And Clara Hale, who'd spent a decade convinced she didn't need one, had finally stopped running long enough to realize that home was exactly what she'd been searching for all along.